The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering windows of Windsor Castle's state dining room, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table that could seat 60 guests. Crown Prince Alexander adjusted his ceremonial uniform for the third time in 10 minutes, the gold braiding feeling heavier with each passing moment. At 28, he had attended countless state dinners, but tonight felt different, more consequential somehow. "Your Highness, the guests will begin arriving in 30 minutes, his private secretary James Whitmore announced from the doorway. The man's crisp accent carried the efficiency that had made him indispensable to the royal household for over a decade. Alexander nodded, his steel-blue eyes scanning the elaborate table settings one final time. Crystal glasses caught the light like scattered diamonds, while arrangements of white roses and ivy created an atmosphere of refined elegance. Tonight's banquet was meant to strengthen diplomatic ties with the Kingdom of Valdoria, a small but strategically important European nation. The visiting delegation included King Ferdinand III and his daughter, Princess Adriana, a young woman Alexander had never met but had heard described in less than flattering terms by certain members of his inner circle. "James," Alexander called as his secretary turned to leave. "What do we know about Princess Adriana? Beyond the official briefings, I mean." Whitmore paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's 25, Your Highness, educated at Cambridge, though she maintained a low profile during her time there. Some describe her as unconventional, perhaps too intellectual for traditional royal expectations." The diplomatic phrasing didn't escape Alexander's notice. In royal circles, such descriptions often masked deeper prejudices, particularly against women who didn't fit the traditional mold of decorative princess expected to smile, wave, and eventually marry advantageously. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Alexander straightened instinctively. His younger sister, Princess Victoria, swept into the room wearing an emerald gown that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. At 26, she possessed the natural grace their mother, Queen Margaret, had always hoped to instill in both her children. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad, rather than a dinner party," Victoria observed, her green eyes sparkling with familiar mischief. "Sometimes I wonder if there's much difference," Alexander replied, managing a wry smile. "How much do you know about tonight's guests?" Victoria's expression grew more serious. "I've heard whispers. Lord Pemberton and his circle have been particularly vocal about the Valdorian princess. They seem to think her disposition makes her an unsuitable ally." Alexander frowned. Richard Pemberton, the Duke of Wessex, commanded significant influence among the more conservative members of the nobility. His opinions often shaped the attitudes of others, and his disapproval could make diplomatic relations considerably more challenging. "What kind of disposition are we talking about?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that threatens small minds," Victoria replied pointedly. "Adriana apparently holds a doctorate in international relations, speaks 6 languages fluently, and has published papers on sustainable economic development. In other words, she's brilliant, and that makes certain people uncomfortable." The implications settled uncomfortably in Alexander's chest. He had spent years learning to navigate the complex expectations of royal life, understanding how easily intelligence in a woman could be perceived as threatening by those seeking to undermine diplomatic relationships or royal authority itself. A soft chime from the castle's clock tower announced the hour. Soon the great hall would fill with the cream of British society, foreign dignitaries, and the ever-present undercurrent of political maneuvering that made such gatherings simultaneously essential and exhausting. "Promise me something," Victoria said, placing her hand on her brother's arm. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that the crown you'll wear someday should protect people, not just tradition." Before Alexander could respond, the sound of arriving vehicles drifted through the windows. The Valdorian delegation had arrived, and with them, the evening that would test not just diplomatic relations, but Alexander's own understanding of what it meant to be a future king. Chapter 2. First Impressions. The receiving line moved with practiced efficiency as guests filed into Windsor's grand ballroom. Alexander stood beside his parents, King William and Queen Margaret, greeting each arrival with the polished charm that years of royal training had perfected. The room buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the rustle of formal evening wear. When King Ferdinand of Valdoria approached with his daughter, Alexander felt an immediate shift in the room's energy. The Valdorian king was a robust man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Princess Adriana, however, seemed to carry herself with a different kind of confidence, intellectual rather than ceremonial. The princess was elegantly tall, with dark hair arranged in a sophisticated chignon and intelligent brown eyes that took in the room with analytical precision rather than nervous uncertainty. Her evening gown was a deep sapphire blue that complemented her complexion, but it was her posture and direct gaze that made her stand out among the assembled guests. "Your Majesty," King Ferdinand said, bowing slightly to King William, "thank you for this gracious welcome. May I present my daughter, Princess Adriana?" Adriana stepped forward with confident grace, curtsying appropriately to both the king and queen before turning to Alexander. "Your Royal Highness, it's an honor to meet you." Her voice carried quiet authority and education, with just a hint of an accent that suggested her multilingual background. When their eyes met during the formal greeting, Alexander caught something, sharp intelligence mixed with wariness, that suggested she was well aware of the challenges her presence might create. "The pleasure is mine, Princess Adriana. I hope you'll find your stay in England productive." "Thank you. I'm particularly looking forward to discussing the renewable energy initiatives we've been developing in Valdoria. I understand Britain has been exploring similar sustainable programs." Before Alexander could respond, Lord Pemberton materialized at his elbow with the practiced stealth of a career politician. The Duke of Wessex was a man who commanded attention, silver-haired, broadly built, with the kind of voice that cut through crowded rooms. "Princess Adriana, how delightful to meet you at last. I was just telling the Earl of Somerset about your academic achievements. Quite unusual for a princess, wouldn't you say?" The comment landed with surgical precision, drawing the attention of nearby guests while maintaining the veneer of polite conversation. Alexander watched Adriana's expression remain perfectly composed, though her eyes sharpened slightly. "I find that education serves any role well, Your Grace," Adriana replied evenly. "Understanding global economics seems particularly relevant for someone who will help govern a nation." "Indeed," Pemberton smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Though some might argue that a princess's time is better spent on more traditional pursuits, charitable work perhaps, or cultural patronage." The circle of listeners had grown, and Alexander could sense the shift in atmosphere. What should have been pleasant diplomatic small talk was becoming something else entirely, a subtle interrogation designed to highlight perceived inappropriateness. Queen Margaret, ever the diplomat, smoothly intervened. "Princess Adriana, you simply must meet our Minister of Energy. He would be thrilled to discuss renewable initiatives with someone who truly understands their economic implications." As the Queen deftly guided Adriana away from Pemberton's sphere of influence, Alexander caught Victoria's eye across the room. His sister's expression mirrored his own concern. This was going to be a longer evening than anticipated. The formal dinner proceeded with typical royal pageantry. Alexander found himself seated several places away from Adriana, who was positioned between Lady Pemberton and the French ambassador's wife. Even from a distance, he could observe how the princess navigated conversation with impressive skill, responding to questions with thoughtful consideration, while subtly steering discussions toward substantive topics. It was during the third course that things began to unravel. Lord Pemberton's son, Charles, had clearly inherited both his father's political instincts and his prejudices. The younger Pemberton, aided by several glasses of wine and an audience of like-minded peers, began to hold court at his end of the table. "I was just wondering," Charles announced loudly enough for half the dining room to hear, "whether Princess Adriana has any experience with traditional royal duties, charity galas, for instance." Adriana looked up from her conversation, clearly aware that all eyes had turned in her direction. "I've organized several development programs in Valdoria, Mr. Pemberton, though I prefer initiatives that address systemic issues rather than merely treating symptoms." "How progressive," Charles replied, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "And what about marriage prospects? Surely a princess of your age has considered her duty to form strategic alliances." The question hung in the air like a deliberate provocation. Alexander watched as Adriana's composure showed the first signs of strain, a slight tightening around her eyes, as she realized she was being deliberately baited in front of an international audience. "I believe," Adriana said quietly, "that my primary duty is to serve my people's interests, not to be traded like a diplomatic commodity." The response was both dignified and defiant, but in this room, among this crowd, it landed like a challenge to traditional expectations. Alexander saw several guests exchange meaningful glances, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized the evening was about to take a turn for the worse. Chapter 3. The Humiliation. The tension in the dining room had become palpable by the time the main course was served. Alexander noticed how Princess Adriana had grown more guarded, her responses becoming more measured, as Charles Pemberton and his associates continued their campaign of public interrogation disguised as polite conversation. "Tell me, Princess Adriana," called out Lady Pemberton from across the table, her voice carrying false sweetness, "what are your thoughts on the role of women in modern monarchy? Surely you have opinions on such matters." Adriana straightened slightly, recognizing the trap but choosing to engage nonetheless. "I believe modern monarchies succeed when they utilize all available talent, regardless of gender. Effective governance requires the best minds working together." "How wonderfully so feminist of you," Charles Pemberton interrupted with a laugh that carried too much wine and too little respect. "I suppose next you'll be telling us that princesses should be running countries instead of gracing them with their beauty." The comment drew uncomfortable chuckles from several guests, and Alexander watched the color rise slightly in Adriana's cheeks. The princess maintained her dignity, but he could see the strain of being treated as an intellectual curiosity rather than a diplomatic equal. "I believe competence should matter more than tradition," Adriana replied carefully. King Ferdinand's jaw tightened, but diplomatic protocol prevented him from directly confronting his host's guests. The Valdorian king could only watch as his daughter endured what was rapidly becoming less about political disagreement and more about personal attack on her character and intelligence. "Charles," Victoria's voice cut through the tension with icy precision, "perhaps you could share your thoughts on renewable energy policy. I'm sure Princess Adriana would value your expertise in sustainable development." The rebuke from Princess Victoria caused a momentary lull, but Charles Pemberton had clearly passed the point of caring about propriety. Emboldened by alcohol and his audience's apparent approval, he reached for the wine decanter near his place setting. "Of course, Your Highness," he said, his movements exaggerated and deliberately theatrical, "though I fear my knowledge is rather more practical than academic." What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. As Charles gestured expansively while speaking, his hand knocked against his wineglass, sending it tumbling across the table. The deep red liquid splashed across the pristine white tablecloth, across several place settings, and directly onto Princess Adriana's elegant sapphire gown. The dining room fell silent, except for the soft drip of wine falling from the edge of the table onto the Persian rug below. Adriana sat frozen, red wine staining the front of her formal evening wear, a gown that bore the colors of her nation and represented her dignity as a royal representative. "Oh my," Charles said, his tone carrying no trace of genuine remorse. "How terribly clumsy of me. Though perhaps red suits you better. It matches your radical ideas." Several guests barely suppressed their laughter, while others looked away in obvious discomfort. This had crossed the line from diplomatic tension into outright insult, and everyone in the room knew it. Princess Adriana slowly placed her napkin on the table and stood, wine still staining her gown. Her face was pale except for 2 spots of color high on her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and controlled anger that she was fighting to contain. "If you'll excuse me," Adriana said quietly, her voice steady despite the circumstances, "I believe I should change." As she moved to leave, Charles Pemberton couldn't resist one final comment. Perhaps something less intellectual this time. That was the moment Alexander had had enough. The Crown Prince rose from his seat with the kind of authority that could silence rooms and command attention. Every eye turned to him as he walked deliberately around the table to where Charles Pemberton sat, still smirking at his own perceived cleverness. "Mr. Pemberton," Alexander said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal displeasure, "your behavior tonight has been a disgrace to this household, to your family name and to the crown itself." The smirk faded from Charles's face as he realized the gravity of his situation. Around the table, guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Your Royal Highness, I was merely—" "You were deliberately humiliating a guest of the crown," Alexander continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Princess Adriana is here under our protection, as our invited guest, and you have insulted not only her, but the Kingdom of Valdoria itself." King William and Queen Margaret watched their son with expressions of surprise and growing pride. This was not the diplomatic Alexander they were accustomed to. This was a future king asserting his authority in defense of what was right. "Furthermore," Alexander continued, "your actions tonight will have consequences. You will issue a formal written apology to Princess Adriana and to King Ferdinand. You will also make a substantial donation to a charity of Princess Adriana's choosing. And you are no longer welcome at official royal functions until further notice." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles Pemberton's face had gone white, while his father sat rigid with fury and embarrassment. Around the table, guests who had been enjoying the spectacle moments before now stared at their plates, suddenly understanding that their entertainment had come at a serious cost. Princess Adriana, who had paused near the doorway when Alexander began speaking, turned back with an expression of surprise and unmistakable gratitude. "Princess Adriana," Alexander said, his tone shifting from commanding to respectful, "please allow our staff to arrange for your gown to be properly cleaned and restored. In the meantime, I hope you'll join me for coffee in the library after dinner. I'd very much like to hear more about those renewable energy initiatives." Chapter 4. Unexpected Understanding. An hour later, Alexander found Princess Adriana in the castle's private library, having changed into an elegant but understated black dress that somehow made her appear even more regal than her formal gown had. She stood before a glass case, containing illuminated medieval manuscripts. Her earlier composure restored, but her thoughtful expression, suggesting the evening's events, still weighed on her mind. "The Book of Hours of the Black Prince," Adriana said without turning around as Alexander approached. 14th century, if I'm not mistaken. The illumination work represents the pinnacle of medieval artistic achievement. "You know your art history as well as economics," Alexander observed, settling into one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace. "Please, sit. I thought we might have that conversation about renewable energy. Properly this time, without interruptions." Adriana turned, offering a smile that transformed her entire face from diplomatically pleasant to genuinely warm. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness, though I suspect you didn't really invite me here to discuss solar panel efficiency. Please, call me Alexander when we're private. And you're right, though I am genuinely interested in sustainable energy. What I really wanted to do was apologize for tonight's dinner. That behavior was inexcusable." Adriana took the chair across from Alexander, her posture more relaxed now that they were away from the formal dining room scrutiny. "You have nothing to apologize for. In fact, I should be thanking you. What you did, no one has ever defended me like that before." The admission was quietly spoken, but carried significant weight. Alexander studied her face, seeing something vulnerable beneath the intellectual confidence. "May I ask you something?" Alexander said. "How often do you face that kind of treatment?" Adriana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace where logs crackled peacefully. "More than I'd like to admit. Being an educated woman in royal circles isn't easily forgiven. I hold a doctorate because I believe knowledge is power, but many see my education as threatening. I speak multiple languages because diplomacy requires understanding, but some interpret that as showing off. And I believe in sustainable development because—" She paused, looking directly at Alexander. "Because I've seen what happens when small nations exhaust their resources trying to compete with larger powers." "Valdoria has faced resource challenges?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Our eastern neighbor has been pressuring us economically, trying to force dependence on their energy exports. My father believes traditional diplomatic approaches will protect our sovereignty, but I think economic independence through renewable energy is our best defense. Unfortunately, my approach is seen as too radical by many of our allies, and apparently by some of yours as well." Alexander felt a growing respect for the woman sitting across from him. "What you said about serving your people's interests rather than being a diplomatic commodity, that wasn't radical. That was courageous." "Tell that to Lord Pemberton," Adriana said with a rueful laugh. Or his son, for that matter. Charles Pemberton is a fool who mistakes misogyny for tradition, Alexander said firmly, and his father's influence comes from fear of change, not respect for genuine leadership. Real authority doesn't require diminishing others to prove its worth. Adriana studied Alexander with renewed interest. You know, when I was told I'd be meeting the Crown Prince of England, I expected someone more like, well, more like them. Traditional, focused on maintaining the status quo. I care about tradition when it serves a purpose, Alexander replied. But tonight it was being used as a weapon against someone who didn't deserve it. That's not leadership. That's insecurity disguised as authority. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thought as the fire cast dancing shadows on the library's rich wood paneling. "Can I tell you something?" Adriana said eventually. "I was dreading this visit. The briefings made it clear that many of your court see educated women as threats to traditional order. I expected to spend 3 days being politely patronized and sent home with meaningless agreements that ignored Valdoria's real needs. And now?" Adriana's smile was genuine this time, reaching her eyes. "Now I'm thinking that maybe there's hope for a real partnership between our nations, one based on mutual respect rather than traditional power dynamics." Alexander felt something shift in his understanding of both diplomacy and leadership. Here was a princess who had been written off by the establishment, but who possessed exactly the kind of thoughtful, innovative approach that the modern world needed. "Adriana," he said, using her name deliberately, "I have a proposition for you. What if we spent tomorrow working together on actual solutions to the economic pressures your country is facing? Not just ceremonial meetings, but real, strategic discussions. I suspect your sustainable approach might be more effective than anyone realizes. You'd be willing to involve yourself in Valdorian affairs?" Adriana asked, clearly surprised. "I'd be willing to support an ally who shares my belief that true progress comes from embracing change rather than fearing it," Alexander corrected. "Besides, I think it's time the Crown demonstrated that we value intelligence over convention." As the evening grew later and their conversation deepened, both royals began to realize that tonight's humiliation had led to something neither had expected, the beginning of a partnership that might reshape not just their personal relationship, but the future of their kingdom's alliance. "Alexander," Adriana said as they finally prepared to leave the library, "what you did tonight at dinner, standing up to Charles Pemberton in front of everyone, that took real courage." "No," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "Real courage is being yourself in a world that constantly demands you be someone smaller. I think you've been showing that kind of courage for years." Chapter 5. A New Understanding. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Windsor Castle's private study as Alexander and Adriana pored over economic reports and sustainability proposals spread across the mahogany desk. What had begun as a formal meeting had evolved into something far more substantial, a genuine collaboration between two royals who had discovered they shared similar visions for modern leadership. "If we establish a joint renewable energy initiative here," Adriana pointed to a section of the economic analysis, "it demonstrates that small nations can achieve energy independence through cooperation rather than dependence on aggressive neighbors." Alexander nodded, making notes on a separate document. "And it shows that Britain supports innovative solutions over traditional power structures. The economic benefits alone might be enough to convince other European nations to join the initiative." A soft knock interrupted their planning. James Whitmore entered carrying a silver tray with coffee and morning newspapers. His usually composed expression carried a hint of concern. "Your Royal Highness," he addressed Alexander, "you might want to see this morning's press coverage." Alexander glanced at the front page of the Times and felt his stomach sink. The headline read, "Royal Confrontation. Prince defends foreign princess in unprecedented dinner drama." Below it was a photograph that someone had apparently taken with a phone during the dinner, showing Alexander standing over a clearly uncomfortable Charles Pemberton. Adriana looked over his shoulder and whistled softly. "Well, that certainly makes things interesting. The coverage is actually quite favorable to your Royal Highness," Whitmore continued carefully, "though Lord Pemberton has issued a statement expressing his disappointment at what he calls an overreaction to youthful indiscretion." Alexander felt a familiar surge of anger, but it was Adriana's quiet laughter that surprised him. "What's amusing about this?" Alexander asked. "The fact that he's still trying to minimize what happened," Adriana replied. Even now, he can't bring himself to acknowledge that deliberately humiliating a foreign princess might actually be serious. "It is serious," Alexander said firmly, "and I'm not backing down from what I said last night." Before Adriana could respond, the study door opened again, this time admitting King William. The king's expression was unreadable as he approached the desk where the two royals were working. "Alexander, Adriana." He nodded to both. "I trust you've seen the morning papers." "Yes, father," Alexander replied, standing respectfully but maintaining eye contact. "I stand by my actions." King William studied his son for a long moment, then turned his attention to the documents spread across the desk. "What's all this?" "We've been working on a joint economic initiative," Adriana explained, her voice steady despite addressing the King of England. "A renewable energy partnership that could help smaller European nations achieve economic independence." "Interesting," the king said, scanning the papers. "And this was your idea?" "It was both of ours, Your Majesty," Adriana replied diplomatically. King William looked between the two royals, something shifting in his expression. "Alexander, walk with me." Father and son moved to the window overlooking the castle gardens, speaking in voices too low for Adriana to overhear. Alexander could see his father's profile as the older man gazed out at the grounds where they had walked together countless times during Alexander's childhood. "You've put me in a difficult position," the king said quietly. "Lord Pemberton commands significant influence in Parliament. His support has been valuable to the crown. His support comes at too high a price if it means tolerating the humiliation of intelligent women," Alexander replied. "Father, I watched them deliberately attack a guest of our house, a princess representing our ally. How could I do nothing?" King William was silent for several minutes, and Alexander began to worry that he had overstepped irreparably. Then his father spoke, his voice carrying an unexpected note of pride. "You know, your mother said something similar last night. She told me that what you did reminded her of why she fell in love with me in the first place, because I was willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was politically inconvenient." Alexander felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "So, you're not angry?" "I'm proud," the king said simply, "though I'm also concerned about the political ramifications. Pemberton isn't someone who forgives easily, and he has allies who will see this as an opportunity to undermine royal authority." "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Alexander said, "but I won't apologize for defending someone who deserved better treatment." King William nodded slowly, then looked back toward the desk where Adriana was politely pretending not to listen to their conversation. "She seems like a remarkable young woman, quite different from what Pemberton's circle led me to expect." "She's exactly the kind of leader the world needs more of," Alexander said. "Brilliant, principled, genuinely committed to progress. We've developed the framework for a partnership that could serve as a model for international cooperation." "Show me," the king said. For the next hour, Alexander and Adriana presented their proposal to King William. The joint renewable energy initiatives, the economic independence programs, the educational exchanges, all of it designed to demonstrate that nations could work together effectively while respecting each other's sovereignty and intelligence. When they finished, the king sat back in his chair with an expression Alexander had rarely seen, genuine, impressed approval. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking diplomacy the crown should be promoting," King William said. "Adriana, I owe you an apology for the treatment you received last night. It was unacceptable, and it won't happen again." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Adriana replied, "though I hope you know that your son's response more than made up for any offense." As the morning progressed into afternoon, the three worked together to refine the proposals that would eventually become a new model for British-European relations. When Adriana and her father departed that evening, it was with agreements that went far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Standing in the castle courtyard as the Valdorian delegation's cars disappeared into the distance, Alexander felt Victoria's presence beside him. "So," his sister said with evident satisfaction, "I take it the visit was successful." "More than successful," Alexander replied. "I think it might have changed everything, including you." Alexander considered the question seriously. 24 hours ago, he had been a prince focused on managing expectations and maintaining stability. Tonight, he felt like someone who had finally understood what leadership actually meant. "Yes," he said finally, "including me." 3 months later, when the British Valdorian Renewable Energy Initiative was officially announced to international acclaim, Alexander would reflect on that evening as the moment he truly began preparing to be king. Not the kind of king who preserved tradition at any cost, but the kind who understood that real tradition lay in protecting justice, defending the intelligent, and building a world worthy of the crown's responsibility. And when Princess Adriana visited again, as she would many times in the years that followed, there would be no doubt about the respect she commanded or the partnership she had earned. Because sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen not in grand conference rooms, but in quiet libraries where two people discover they share the same vision of what leadership should mean.